Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week we have the great schus of reading Parashat Behaalotekha, which is really one of the most beautiful and one of the most challenging parashiot in the Torah. And last year we focused on the first part of the parasha. Today I'd like to focus on the back end of the parasha. And this requires a slight introduction. Rav Soloveitchik, the Rav, has this unbelievable speech, which if anybody has time to access it on YU Torah, they could listen to the Rav go through the parsha. But it has essentially one point. And he's trying to understand why Vayhi bin Saharon, Vayomo Moshe, right, the Nun Hafuchot, what that's coming to break up in the Torah and why that's coming here in the parsha. And the Rav says there, and it would be wrong and maybe disrespectful to say the Ramban passes like the Rav. It's the reverse. But the Ramban definitely buys into this narrative. Before Vayhi bin Saharon, everything is going smoothly, right? History is happening, is playing out the way it's supposed to, and we're supposed to go into Eretz Yisrael. And this is supposed to be the final journey. Beha'alotekha is supposed to be more or less the last parsha in the Torah. We're in the Midbar for a year, we sit at Har Sinai, and then we're in. And then the rest of Jewish history starts. And the Rav points to, among other things, Vayomer Moshe lechovama ben Reuel hamidyani chotein Moshe nosim anachnu al hamakom asher amar Hashem oto atein lachem lecha itanu ve'itavnu lach ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael. The Rav talks about, you could feel Moshe's excitement. This is it. We're about to go on the final journey. He's begging his father-in-law, come with us. V'yah hatov asher itiv Hashem, right? All the goodness will happen to you as well. And then comes what the Rav refers to as the inversion of Jewish history. The Nun Hapuchot, the upside down Nunim, changed Jewish history. What happens? The next sin. Vayhi ha'am kimit onanim rabba aznei Hashem. We'll come back to that in a second, right? And God gets angry at them. And then he says basically all of history changes. Moshe Rabbeinu gets frustrated. Vayom Moshe Hashem lama harayota la'avdecha v'lama lo matzati chen beinecha. Why is it always my fault? Right? How am I going to get meat for them? And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Yisrael. And basically, that's the diversion of Jewish history. This sin of the mitonanim, which in and of itself, we'll talk about in a second, is not that tragic. But somehow, Moshe understood that if we don't go in now, we're not going in. The reason why we don't go into Eretz Yisrael immediately is obviously next week's parsha, is Chet HaMeraglim. That's Parsha Shlach. But the sense you get, and hopefully we'll get it from the Rambans as well, the sense you get is that this is it. Moshe understood immediately that something terrible is going on. And, God gets angry, Uve'enei Moshe Ra. And Moshe himself, who's normally the great defender of Am Yisrael and Klal Yisrael, somehow here his hands are tied, and he has nothing to say, and he has nothing to do. So what's going on? So let's start in Parak Yud Aleph, Pasuk Aleph. Vayhi ha'am kimit onanim rabba aznei Hashem, vayishma Hashem vayicha rapo vativar bam eish Hashem vatochal biktzei ha'machaneh. Something terrible happens, and it ends with a fire in part of the camp. So the Ramban wants to know, what does the word mitonanim mean? We know in the context, but what does it really mean? So he says, Amar Rabbi Avraham, says the Ibn Ezra, migizrat avon. Mitonanim comes as if the pasuk would say, the people sinned. V'chein machshivot onecha. Similarly, the pasuk in Yirmiyahu, where they thought about the sin that they committed. Shedibru divrei aven. That they spoke, and their speech constituted a sin. Says Ramban, Ve'inenu nachon. No. Ki lama yechaseh katuv al chata'am v'lo yagidenu ka'asher asa b'chol ha'mekamot. Says the Ramban, the Torah doesn't hide the sins of Am Yisrael. Maybe recently that's become like more of a theme in Jewish history to hide. We don't want to say anything bad about Am Yisrael. But says Ramban, if Am Yisrael sinned, the Torah would tell us. So what's the sin? Why is the Torah hiding it? And, again, as we said at the beginning, it's much more significant because this is really the sin that changes the course of Jewish history. And says the Ramban, V'hanachon be'enai, ki ka'asher nitrachaku mehar Sinai, shehaya karov liyishuv, because as the Jewish people left Har Sinai, which was close to civilization. If you recall, Moshe Rabbeinu was shepherding Yisro's flock at Har Sinai, so it was close to the Yishuv. Uvo b'toch hamidbar hagadol v'hanora b'masa harishon, and now they're traveling into the heart of this gigantic barren desert with no sources of food. Hayu mitzta'arim be'atzmam. They were sad. Lemor, ma na'aseh ve'eich nichyeh b'midbar hazeh. How are we going to get along in the midbar? How are we going to survive? Uma nochal, uma nishteh. What are we going to eat and what are we going to drink? Ve'eich nispol ha'amal v'ha'inui u'matayim neitzei mimenu. How are we going to put up with the inconvenience and the difficulty of living in the desert? And when are we going to get out? He says, Milashon ma yitonein adam chai gever al chata'av. Right? How when you bemoan something, when you're frustrated by something, when you're disappointed by something, so you complain about it. Shehu lashon ko'ev u'mitzta'er al atzmo. It's a lashon of, I'm unhappy with my life. I'm disappointed with how things are going. V'chein ben oni. Right? Rachel died as she was giving birth to Binyamin, and she was sad, obviously. So she called him Ben Oni, the son of my troubles. Va'aviv karalo Binyamin. And Yaakov called him by a happy name. Ben Sa'ari is what Rachel called him. Okay, etc. V'ka'asher amar hakatuv ki ayu ko'avim u'mitztarim kvar hizkir v'siper b'chet. Says the Ramban, that complaining, a strong word, that whining of Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar, that is their sin. That's the great frustration to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. After the Eser Makos, after Kriyas Yamsuf, after the Man, which came already, they're still complaining. They're still unhappy. They don't want to go in the Midbar because of the creature comforts. God is frustrated by this. V'amar kim mitonenim. Why is the kaf hadimyon? They were like they complained. Ki ayu midabrim b'mar nafsham. It wasn't so much what they said; it was how they said it. Sometimes you meet people who are just, depressed with their lives and they're frustrated and they're sad, and you hear it in their voices, even if they're not really saying so. Kashe yasu akovim, like anybody who's frustrated. V'haya ra be'einei Hashem. Why was it so frustrating to God? It says it was bad to God, but I think he means frustrating. Why? Shehaya lahem lalechet acharav b'simcha v'tuv levav merov kol tova asher nasan lahem. They should have been thrilled. They should have been excited. We didn't deserve any of this. We should have been happy that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to take care of us in the Midbar. And rather, v'heim hayu ka'anusim umuchrachim. It was like we were being forced into it. Like God forbid we were hostages. Mitonenim umitra'amim al inyanam. And they complained and they expressed disappointment. Or said differently, their tone was such that they were suffering. Yeah, I'll do it, but. What's the but? I'm unhappy about it. I'm going to miss all the things that I miss about living in civilization. That's what frustrated HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Kach omar b'shniya vayashuvu vayivku gam b'nei Yisrael. The second time, they also complained. Ki haya chatam harishon lehitraem al chisaron hanotehem bamidbar. Because their first complaint was simply the lack of creature comforts. They're frustrated, they're disappointed that they have to put up with anything on their way to Eretz Yisrael. V'yashuvu od lasod ka'inyan ahu v'lo lakhu musar al eish Hashem sheba'arabam. They should have learned that being negative and being frustrated and being depressed with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with all that He's done for them, it's almost kiviyachol, like God was hurt by that. God wanted them to celebrate. And instead, they came across as a whiny bunch. And that was the Aveira. It wasn't that they said anything. It wasn't that they challenged HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It wasn't that, God forbid, they weren't going to keep the Torah. But they were unhappy. And God wanted them to be happy. God was disappointed. They were kimbit onanim. They didn't challenge anything, but they were not the people they were supposed to be after the whole transition. After all of Yitzias Mitzrayim and the miracles that God had done, it's a year later, they should have been transitioning from slaves to free people. And God doesn't see it. And he's frustrated and he's disappointed. Okay, now we'll continue in the Psukim and in the Ramban. So the Psukim say as follows. Vayichar apo, vayitzak amel Moshe, vayitpalel Moshe l'Adonai vatishka ha'esh. Vayikra shem hamakom ahu taveira, ki va'aravam eish Adonai. Right, so the first thing, God gets angry at them. There's a fire. Moshe makes it go away, but they don't learn the lesson. The pasuk immediately after, pasuk Dalet. V'asafsuf, the rabble, asher bikirbo, hit avu ta'ava. Vayashuvu vayivku gam b'nei Yisrael vayomru mi ya'achilenu basar. Once again, whining. This time, there's a particular request. We want meat, say the people. Okay? The Ramban's going to focus, I think, mostly on this really interesting phrase. Hit avu ta'ava. Literally, what does it mean? That we're not, they didn't, it should have said, V'asafsu Hashem kabo, hit avu. Right? Hit avu ta'ava. They literally desired a desire. And here you come to like a bigger problem. Says the Ramban. Pasuk Dalet. Shelo haya lahem chisaron b'midbar. They had everything they needed. They knew they were going to be fine. Ki haya lahem haman lasova. They had plenty of man. V'hayu osim bo mat'amim shonim b'ta'am chashuv ma'od kashe yisaper. And out of the man, we learned this medrash when we were in kindergarten, but out of the man they could create all kinds of food that had all kinds of tastes. So there's no taste that they didn't have. Aval himshilu b'nafshotam ta'ava rabba. But they imagined, they created for themselves a great desire. Kimitavim la'achol ha'pechamim v'he'afar v'hama'achalim ha'nivashim. Right? Mashal l'ma davar doma. Maybe it's not you, but maybe it's me. You have a great meal, and you're completely full. But you want chocolate. You want a piece of chocolate cake. You want something else. Now, you don't need it. Not for your diet, not for your health. You don't need it at all. It's hit avu ta'ava. You create for yourself a need that doesn't even exist, that doesn't really exist. If I don't have chocolate cake, I'm going to, what? You're going to be fine. So says the Ramban, that's exactly right. These people who God was supporting anyway by way of the man, and I should point out here, the Ramban knows this, but he ignores the point. There was a part of the man which was not completely satisfying, and that is, you couldn't hold on to any of it. So you needed the miracle of God that every single morning he brought down lechem min hashamayim. And had he not done that, when you went to sleep at night, there was an issur of leaving man over. When you went to sleep at night, quote unquote, your pantry, your cupboards were bare. You had no food. And you had to say to yourself, if God doesn't bring me food in the morning miraculously, me and my family are going to starve. Nevertheless, so the sense you get is that hitavu ta'ava, their desire was to be completely secure. They wanted to have enough food. They wanted to be able to look in the kitchen and see the next bunch of meals sitting there. And so they say, Vayomru mi ya'achilenu basar. Who's going to feed us meat? Says the Ramban, Ki lo haya lechal ha'am basar le'echol b'chol yom. They did not have enough meat to eat every single day. Af al pi she'achlu mimenu pamim rabot. V'haya limikzatam mikneh. On the one hand, we already had the story of the Slav. And God brought meat, and so they had meat. Second of all, the more successful of them, the richer of them, had their own flocks. They could have slaughtered a lamb and have steak for dinner. V'achlu mimenu hagdolim. So the bigger ones, the greater ones, did do that. Kimin hagamachanodu mikamot hayoker. As anybody who's I don't want to say rich, but anybody who's rich, they would do. Alva bidagim amru zachanu et hadaga ki zocher hanishkachot ki lo achlu dagim miyom tzeitam mitzrayim vadheina. A big admission, says the Ramban, with respect to fish, and we'll see this in a second, they remembered the taste. They had fish in Mitzrayim. And it's true, says the Ramban, they hadn't had fish since the day they left Mitzrayim. For the entirety of the time that they traveled, that they were in Har Sinai, that they built the Mishkan, no fish. Okay, so it could be, on some level, people miss the taste of fish, if you love fish. I personally don't. But if you do, maybe you miss the taste. But with respect to meat, there's no missing the taste. A, they had meat. They already complained about meat. Second of all, they didn't need it. So here it's almost like, I don't want to have to rely on God tomorrow morning to make a miracle. If I have a lot of meat in my kitchen, okay, so if there's no man tomorrow, I'll be fine. But that's what I want. And that's what the people were complaining about. And now you go to the next pasuk. The next pasuk is a fascinating pasuk. Says the pasuk, Zacharnu et hadaga shenochal b'Mitzrayim chinam. We remember the daga, the food that we ate in Mitzrayim, for free. Eit hakishuim ve'eit ha'avatichim ve'et ha'chatzir ve'et ha'betzalim ve'et ha'shumim. V'ata navshenu yveisha ein kol bilti ala maneinenu. Now all we have is the man. So first of all, just in an obvious way, right? They're rejecting this amazing miracle that God makes every single day, and that God's going to make for the next 40 years, or the next 39 years, right? They don't want the man. They want something else. They want meat. And they remember what it tasted like in Mitzrayim. So there's a number of medrashim here that most people know. The major question is that really true? They're saying, we remember what we ate in Mitzrayim. What did we eat in Mitzrayim? Kishuim, leeks, avatichim, watermelons, chatzir, b'tzalim, garlic, shumim, right? We had a great life in Mitzrayim. So first of all, it's offensive to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, obviously, because they didn't have a great life in Mitzrayim. They had a miserable life in Mitzrayim. The Egyptians were horrific to them. And God miraculously took us out. And now it's not just that Bnei Yisrael are rejecting the man, which would be offensive enough to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're almost saying it was so much better for us in Mitzrayim. But the Ramban grants this, because you could say it's not true, but the Ramban has an interesting pshat. He says, no, it's true. Lefi pshutom in pasuk ki ayu adayagim hamitzriyim ma'avidin otan limshoch hadagim shene'echazim b'mitzudav u'machmarot. He said, one of the jobs they had in Egypt was to lay out the big traps to catch food, to put out big nets into in the water. Vayu notnim lahem min hadagim ki minhag kol parsei michmarot. Okay, he said, the fact of the matter is, it's true. When they caught a bunch of fish, so like any other fishing establishment, the Egyptians let the Jews take some of the fish. They caught them, so they had some of the fish. V'hakishuim v'havatichim v'hachatzir v'habetzalim v'hashuim. And as to the vegetables, b'mitzrayim harbei mod. Egypt was a very, very rich country. Kihi kigan hayarak, literally, it's like a garden of vegetables. V'cha'asher hayu chofrim lahem biginot uv'chol avodah basadeh. And when the Jews worked in the fields of the Egyptians, hayu ochlim min hayarakot. Yeah, they would eat the vegetables. Okay, so the first answer of the Ramban is it's completely true. They did eat b'mitzrayim chinam, eita avatichim ve'eta b'tzalim. They ate all of these things. Everybody did. There was tons of it in Mitzrayim, right? Or a second possibility, which is really the same shot. O shayu sham Yisrael avdei hamelech, because they were slaves of the king. Basically, they were employees of the government. O sin malachto. So the Paro gave them, a little water and a little wheat. But they went around in the city. They got to eat from people's fields and no one stopped them, because that's what the king does. When the king employs you, even if you're slaves, he lets you eat. Okay, so either way, and it's really kind of shockingly, the Ramban thinks it's true. They're not just imagining it. They're not just pretending that life was great in Egypt. in a small factual way, it was true. They ate dagim, they ate avatichim, they ate shumim, they ate bitzalim, they ate all the things that they said. Says the Ramban, it's true. But it wasn't really their own food. And they're really remembering it in a way that's not representative of what it was. Obviously, Paro could have stopped this at any time. The fishermen in Egypt could have refused to give them fish on any day. The people whose fields they ate from could have refused them. And now they're ignoring that, and they're assuming the worst about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and they're giving the Egyptians, their enslavers, the benefit of the doubt. And I think HaKadosh Baruch Hu, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is different and distant from us, and it's hard to establish, and it's hard to ascribe motives to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But that's who we are, and that's what we're left with. And the fact that this would be frustrating to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, on a very personal level, the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would be so frustrated that after all that he did for us and all the progress that he expected from us, this is how we repay him with this kind of whining and this kind of attitude, it's harsh and it's hard. Okay, now we come to, let's see if I could find it quickly. Okay, now they're asking for all this from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayam Moshe l'Adonai, lama harayota la'avdecha v'lama lo motzati chen b'necha lasumet masa kala amazeh alai. He'anochi hariti et ha'am hazeh manochi liditihu ki tomar elai sa'eu b'chekecha kashe yisaha omenet hayonek al ha'adamah shenishbata lavutav. Moshe Rabbeinu was complaining now about the burden that God placed on him. And now a difficult pasuk. Me'ayin li basar latet l'chol ha'am hazeh. Ki yivku alai le'mor t'nalanu v'asav v'nochela. Okay, that's really the pasuk. Where am I going to get meat from to give to them? Right? It doesn't work that way. Okay. Now, in theory, this is much, much worse than Moshe at Mei Merivah. This is much, much worse than he hit the rock and he should have spoken to the rock. And, here is he. It sounds like he's questioning HaKadosh Baruch Hu's ability to deliver. Where are we going to get the meat from? And so the Ramban has really a fantastic insight. I'm in the middle of, there's a really long Ramban on Pasuk Yud Zayin of the same parak we've been in the whole time, Parak Yud Aleph. And at the end of that long Ramban, the Ramban says, V'hanachon etzli, ki ka'asher ya'aseh Hashem ototu movsim li Yisrael. When God does a miracle for the Jewish people, which it would have taken to bring all this meat, chesed heim me'ito. It's a chesed. It's a great goodness that God is doing for the Jewish people. V'kulan latov lahem. And the purpose of every miracle is for the betterment of the Jewish people. Ki tov Hashem lakol v'rachamav al kol ma'asav, a pasuk we know well from Ashrei. Okay, that's the standard. When God does a miracle, it's because He loves us. It's because He wants to do a chesed for us. Zulati kashe yetzeh ketzef al ovrei ritzono, unless God is so angry at the people who are violating His Torah, sheya'aseh imahem ba'af uvemidat hadin l'ra'ah gemura. Unless the opposite. Unless God brings a plague, unless God brings a fire, unless God punishes us in some way, and then it's a punishment, it's not a miracle. Vihine, says the Ramban, Ein benisim rak tova gemura shlema berachamim. Either there's the midas harachamim, in which God does great good things for us, o nekama b'midat hadin, or there's anger via the midas hadin. There's the judgment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then we're punished. Aval ata kishe amar lo sheyitain lahem sheilatam v'yochlu basar ad asher yitzeh me'apchem v'yalachem lezara. But now, says the Ramban, Moshe Rabbeinu doesn't understand what's going on, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, fine, I'll do it, but I'm going to do it in a way that's going to kill them. They're going to regret having asked for it. And Moshe says, wait, on the one hand, it's not a chesed that God's doing. On the other hand, it's not midat hadin, because God is saying, I'm going to give them what they want. So Yada Moshe Rabbeinu shelo yiyeh ot me'et Hashem livrot lahem basar ka'asher natan lahem dagan shamayim. God is not going to create a miracle like he did other times. Moshe knew that intuitively. Kinyan shamru chachamim ein davar ra yored min hashamayim. I think it's actually a song now, right? The idea is, if God brings down something from heaven, it's not going to be evil. It's not going to cause a problem. Va'od, in addition, ki kol hanisim yodiyei Moshe hineni mamtir lachem lechem min hashamayim. God says, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Hineni omeid lefnei Hashem al atzor, go stand on the rock. Aval bekan shamar lo ve'el ha'am tomar hit kadshu lemachar v'lo hodio. He told them, yes, something big is going to happen tomorrow. But he didn't tell them what it is. Hevin Moshe shelo yihyeh zeh b'neis me'ito yitbarach. Whatever is going to come tomorrow, Moshe Rabbeinu understood, it's not going to be miraculous. Va'al kein sha'al bitmiya. So then he said, God, wait. Ma ya'aseh lohem kidech kol haaretz im yishachet lohem tsonu v'akar mikol svivotehem v'lo yaspik lohem. How could it be, practically speaking, what's going to happen? If you're not going to do it miraculously, how could it be that we gather up enough meat from our surrounding areas that will be enough for 600,000 men between the ages of 20 and 60? Doesn't make sense. Even if you gathered up all the fish in the sea nearby, it still won't be enough. So it wasn't Moshe Rabbeinu, God forbid, doubting HaKadosh Baruch Hu, doubting the omnipotence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God forbid. No. It was Moshe saying, if you're not going to do it miraculously, and you're saying you're not, because it's sort of good, but it's sort of bad, right? You're going to answer what they wanted, but in the end, it's going to be bad for them. That's neither a miracle for good through midas harachamim or a miracle for bad through midas hadin. So how's it going to work? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, "V'Hashem heishivo ki ein yad Hashem kitzara latet lehem sheilatam gam b'derech hamikrim." Says the Ramban, yes, God has the ability to operate miraculously, but God also has the ability of operating miraculously through the derech hata'ava. Yes, could we have gathered enough meat? Could Moshe Rabbeinu have done it? No. So in a certain way, it is miraculous, but it's completely natural. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do it naturally. V'zetam hayikrecha dvarim lo. You'll see. Va'amar hayad Hashem tiktzar klashon v'yein malchut rav ki yad hamelach. They happen to have a lot. V'lo amar Hashem hamimeni yipalei kol davar ki lo yaseh zot b'mofes. The Ramban says, but God's not being defensive. It's not a miracle. V'chein haya, and that's exactly what happened. Shenasa ruach me'et Hashem kimin hago shel olam. The Ramban has an unbelievable insight here into the psukim. A regular wind came. Lo ruach yam chazak ma'od, v'lo ruach kadim azak kashe yaskir b'moftim. Not like Kriyas Yamsuf, where the Torah says how it happened, but it tells you it was ruach yam chazak kol halayla. It was an unusually strong wind. Aval ruach stam. No, this was not a miracle. A regular wind. Kin nehugim vayagos salvim min hayam. It brought the slav from the sea. Lo shin nivra atam ba'avuram. It wasn't a miracle. Yesh me'ayin. God created the slav. No. Ve'ein b'davar chidush mitivo shel olam. It wasn't anything different than the way nature works. It was just that God said in response to the request, I'll do it because I have to, because otherwise they'll doubt me. But you should know, I'm not doing it by way of a miracle. I'm doing it by way of natural occurrences. And Moshe Rabbeinu had every right to ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu how that's going to work. If God's going to make a miracle, it would be completely inappropriate to ask, can you do this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu? The things that Moshe said, right? It would be completely inappropriate. That would be the right thing. Right? All these things would be true. But since God is going to do it in a natural way, Moshe Rabbeinu was correct to ask. Okay, so what we saw today was one theme, which is really HaKadosh Baruch Hu's disappointment or HaKadosh Baruch Hu's frustration with Am Yisrael. And the idea that we needed some period of time to transfer from being slaves, and there's a slave mentality, and it's a lack of confidence, to being Abdei Hashem. And that should have happened at Har Sinai. And now HaKadosh Baruch Hu sees in the most frustrating way that didn't happen. That the people are still full of doubts about him, doubts about the past. They remember they remember Mitzrayim as a better place than it really was. And on some level, you feel HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hurt. And you feel Moshe Rabbeinu's hurt, maybe more than that. And Moshe Rabbeinu's frustration. And Moshe Rabbeinu saying, I didn't sign up for this. It's really like a sense that Moshe Rabbeinu is beaten down right now. It's enough already, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I need Shivim Ish, Miziknei Yisrael. I need different ways out because it's not working this way. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so disappointed in Am Yisrael. And Moshe Rabbeinu understands at this moment that he's not going into Eretz Yisrael. Somehow he understands that this frustration, that in some way, I want to be careful how I say the word, he's failed. He's not gotten to the people to where they should be at this point. And therefore, they're not going into Eretz Yisrael anytime soon. He's not going in ever, really. And it's frustrating to him and it's disappointing. And maybe it's depressing. And maybe Moshe Rabbeinu is going through exactly what Am Yisrael is going through in the sense that they really feel like they're not making the progress that they should have made. Okay? That's it for today. Yashkoch to everybody. Shabbat Shalom and see you next week.